A solitary figure bends over a time-worn desk, candlelight dancing across yellowed pages as distant thunder murmurs through the vaulted chamber. Here begins our descent into Nostradamus's Midnight Chronicle. In this dim sanctum, a forgotten manuscript, scrawled in 16th century French, trembles with portent, 10 quatrains that pulse like a heartbeat, each echoing with warnings of a world teetering on the brink in 2025. At first glance, the scholar's gloved hand hovers above the text, hesitating, yet the weight of history demands closer scrutiny. Why did this prophetic voice, born amidst plague and political upheaval, foresee storms and wars that mirror our own? With every turn of the fragile leaf, the whisper of an ancient seer grows louder, insisting that we listen. Suddenly, the scholar's calm analysis gives way to the first tremor of narrative. The room's shadows lengthen, as if reacting to the quatrain's grim promise. Objective commentary yields to visceral storytelling visions of flooded coastal cities, of exiled populations crying out beneath iron skies. Surged to life, we pause, breathing in the scholar's burden. To decode archaic metaphors is to confront our collective anxieties, pandemics that revive forgotten fears, cyber attacks that plunge entire continents into darkness, conflicts ignited by desperation. Each prophecy becomes a scene in a larger drama, a rising crescendo that propels us forward. By the flicker of candle and flash of lightning, the purpose crystallizes. This is no dry lecture on historical curiosities, but an urgent journey through 10 spectral mirrors, each reflecting today's crises back at us in uncomfortably precise detail. As ominous chords swell, the whispered voiceover beckons. Heed the warnings, or be consumed by them. In this prologue, mystery and analysis entwine, setting the stage for a narrative that climaxes with the revelation that 2025 may already be upon us, its fate written centuries ago, yet still ours to shape. In the hush of a cavernous chamber, candlelight trembles against ancient stone as if reluctant to reveal the first of Nostradamus's 10 dark visions, and you, drawn forward by an inexplicable pull, find yourself on the precipice of revelation. Les cunos signers valeron Rome. Les sarg seren en alarm supreme, Lilith's or de lourd domain, fair and subit for her contra l'empire. Translated, it whispers through the centuries. When our lords keep watch in Rome, the Sardinians will sound the supreme alarm. The Italians driven from their land will suddenly rage against the empire, and in Vietnamese, it resonates anew. Kisiasi kua tqsa chung takan gak tai Rome. Ingui Sardinia se rio bauming tsi thir, ingui. Alu von kieximen, bct thin onagi and cham lai dichel. At once, objective voices rise to unpack the 16th century code. Signers are not mere nobles, but the hidden global powers charting destinies from gilded chambers. Sards are every marginalized community rising from the shadows. Empire encompasses our modern hegemonies of finance, ideology, and influence. Yet, before the scholar's quill can trace these definitions across fragile parchment, the room expands into a living tableau. The United Nations Security Council convenes beneath frescoed arches in Rome. Delegates' solemn profiles illuminated by harsh overhead lights, while behind them, vast screens flicker with satellite feeds of Mediterranean streets choked by tear gas and electric tension. Here the story plunges from analysis into visceral immediacy. Rioters surge in narrow alleys, placards high, their voices melding into a thunderous chorus of protest that cuts through corridors of power like a blade. Then, in a sudden pivot, back to study, the narration halts to emphasize how this quatrain mirrors today's migrant upheavals. Thousands, propelled by war, by climate-scarred homelands, by economies in freefall, only to be met with barbed wire and political scapegoating. But scholarly detachment shatters once more as our focus narrows to a solitary Sardinian protester, standing before armored lines, her voice raw with defiance. We have no voice, she declares, her words lingering in the charged air, forcing onlookers to reckon with the human cost behind every headline. In that heartbeat of silence, the candle's flame flickers violently, elongating shadows into writhing phantoms that seem to dance to the prophecy's drumbeat. Then the drama surges and intercepted signal crackles through hidden speakers, Morse code coalescing into a chilling pronouncement. The alarm sounds at midnight. Sirens wail in the distance, their keening overlap with the scholar's escalating heartbeat as he scribbles furiously, bridging past, at present in a fevered attempt to comprehend whether this is forewarning or fate. Objective insight re-enters the fray. Historians note the uncanny alignment of this quatrain. With Europe's southern migration crisis, Sicilian ports overflowing, refugee camps sprawling, right-wing rhetoric on the rise, yet the narrative refuses to settle into sober exposition. Instead, we are thrust back into storytelling's crucible, where every fragment of analysis fuels rising tension. The Security Council's chair pounds the gavel, screens fracture under digital assault, and the once academic chamber teeters on the brink of chaos. Through it all, the prophecy's cadence measured, inexorable echoes like a tolling bell, the guardians of power in Rome, the clamoring voices of the dispossessed, the abrupt fury unleashed against monolithic structures, and as the candle gutters, plunging the room into near darkness, the scholar's whispered refrain reverberates through your spine. Once the alarm sounds, there can be no turning back. In this single, breathless movement from enigmatic verse to rigorous decoding, from stark commentary to pounding drama, the first quatrain transforms into a living parable, a dramatic overture that propels listeners ever deeper into Nostradamus's Midnight Chronicle, where the past shadow stretches long into 2025, demanding that we listen, understand, and perhaps, if we dare, change the course of prophecy before time itself slips through our fingers. Beneath the flicker of candlelight, the second quatrain emerges like a half-whispered threat from centuries past, its archaic verse hinting at fractures along the continent's eastern edge. Quan legal de l'Occident plongeris seres vers la glaciali, les terres noires fremiront sous la paz des fanissins. Translated, it foretells that when the western eagle plunges its talons toward the frozen dawn, the black earth will tremble beneath the infantry's march, a puzzle that scholars decode as a prophecy of great power aggression in Eastern Europe. At once, we shift from hushed reverence to stark analysis. The eagle of the West evokes modern NATO forces. Frozen dawn conjures the wintry steppes of Ukraine. Black earth nods to its fertile Chernozem plains, now scarred by conflict. Yet before we can settle into detached commentary, the narrative surges forward. Imagine satellite imagery revealing columns of armored vehicles, snaking through snow-crusted forests at dawn, artillery flashes lighting the horizon like ghastly fireworks. A lone war correspondent's voice cuts through the tension, her breath visible in the cold air. As she murmurs, "They came without warning," and in that instant, prophecy and present-day horror collide. Objective insight returns, labeling this quatrain a mirror of current escalations, frozen supply routes under siege, civilian trains repurposed as shelters, peace talks that falter under the weight of distrust. But the drama refuses to relent. Intercepted communique crackles over encrypted channels. Operation White Talon begins at first light. The candle's flame shudders, shadows dance over weapon-stained maps, and the scholar's quill hovers uncertainly above the page. Is this mere prediction, or a call to heed humanity's most fragile fault lines as drums of war beat louder? Listeners are left suspended between dread and revelation, haunted by the echo of a centuries-old verse that still rings true on the windswept battlefields of 2025. In the dim glow of a solitary lantern, a faded quatrain materializes as though summoned by the humid night air itself. Quan le dragon du levant craquerus unvenin, les marches noires vomerant lure moisten empoisonné, sous l'ombre des palmières, les rives se draperont, delincios tisses de fièvre et de supers. Translated, it warns that when the eastern dragon breathes his venom, black markets will spew tainted harvests, and beneath the palm's shadow, riverbanks will don shrouds woven from fever. It sighs an unmistakable prophecy of a new pandemic wave in Southeast Asia. Suddenly, we shift from hushed awe to crisp analysis. Dragon du Levant evokes the region's monsoon winds and trade routes. Marches noires hints at unregulated wildlife trade. The fevered shrouds speak to feverish patients lining the Mekong's banks. Yet, before cold interpretation settles, the narrative surges to life. Picture a crowded Bangkok hospital at midnight. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Exhausted doctors swabbing trembling villagers whose lungs burn with an unidentifiable pathogen. Through the hall, the scholar's measured voiceover cuts in 16th century metaphors cloak. Modern biosecurity failures, zoonotic spillovers ignored until they erupt. Then we're plunged back into drama as a clandestine clip crackles on a hidden frequency. A lab technician's frantic whisper, "Containment has failed, samples escaped at dawn." Objective insight re-enters, noting that illicit markets in exotic meats and lax border controls have long been tinder for viral sparks. But the suspense refuses to abate. Downstream, fishing boats patrol empty piers, their engines silent under curfew. While anonymous messages scroll across encrypted screens, the serpent stirs at the equator, the lantern flickers, casting elongated specters on cracked walls, and the scholar's quill hovers, caught between recording history and pleading for action. In that charged moment, listeners teeter on the edge of revelation and dread. Gripped by a prophecy that transcends centuries to demand, we confront our vulnerability. Before the next wave breaks upon these ancient shores, beneath the wavering glow of a lone lantern, the fourth quatrain drifts into view as if carried on a rising tide of fate. Quan viendra les flots or de lure lit ancient, les sight cities trembleront sous lures plores, les barques aranis precis par le vent, appelleront en vain les heroes in glaudis. Translated, it murmurs, when ancient waters break free from their old beds, coastal cities will tremble beneath their tears, wandering boats, shattered by the wind, will call in vain for heroes submerged. At once, we step from the hush of antiquity into sharp-eyed analysis. The ancient waters are not mere floods, but the restless ocean stirred by a warming world. Tears signal inundations fueled by monster storms, while wandering boats fragment in tempest winds a forewarning of our climate crisis, manifesting in walls of water that laugh at levees. Yet before the scholar's pen can etch these truths on no fragile parchment, the narrative surges forward into dramatic immediacy. Picture Jakarta's neon skyline at midnight, skyscrapers reflected in puddles that swell with each gust, an angry sea clawing at asphalt streets, emergency. Sirens drone like monstrous beasts, and drones buzz overhead, scanning for survivors as families huddle on rooftops, clutching soaked photographs. In the command center, 8 straight red dots on digital maps, New York's Lower Manhattan, Miami's Oceanfront Boulevard, Mumbai's historic Kyiv blinking peril. The scholar's voice returns, crisp and measured, 16th century. Metaphor becomes 21st century reality as sea levels rise and storms intensify, turning bustling ports into archipelagos of stranded souls. But the tension refuses to relent. A hurried transmission crackles through. Dike breach as Sector 9 evacuate immediately. Lantern light flickers violently, casting the storm's roar against stone walls, as though the prophecy itself strains to escape Dot in this charged moment. The boundary between analysis and testimony dissolves. Listeners feel salt spray on their skin, hear the wail of a world undone, and understand that this quatrain is not just verse, but a clarion call. When the ancient waters rise, no city, no empire can stand unmoored against the flood. Dot in the dim chambers flicker. The fifth quatrain drifts into focus like smoke from a dying fire. Quan Lord du Pachacamac se perdre dans la poussière, les faux affamis marquèrent sur les palais, les temples divers succombrant et la colère, et le soleil rouge vers sun train renverse. Translated, it warns, when Pachacamac's gold is lost to dust, hungry crowds will march upon gilded halls, temples of glass will crumble in their wrath, and the red sun will witness its throne overturn. At once, we step from whispered prophecy into clear-eyed analysis. Pachacamac, the ancient Incan oracle, stands for the region's buried wealth now ephemeral in the face of economic ruin. Temples of glass evoke modern skyscrapers and stock exchanges. The red sun hints at ideological fervor and political upheaval. Yet before the scholar's quill can annotate these symbols, the narrative bursts to life on the streets of Santiago at dusk. Imagine shuttered storefronts boarded against hyperinflation, the air thick with the tang of unrest. A lone street lamp casts long shadows over chanting masses brandishing empty metal pans. A raw, rhythmic percussion of protest. Security forces in riot gear advance under neon signs, corporate logos. Now ghostly in the haze, while above, drones hover like metallic vultures. Objective commentary returns. Historians trace this quatrain's lineage to past collapses, noting how speculative bubbles and resource plundering sow desperation. But the drama refuses to relent as clashes erupt. Tear gas clouds blossom into pallid flowers. Protesters scramble over fallen barricades, and a steel and glass trading tower shudders under the impact of a makeshift battering ram. Dot in a sudden pivot, the red sun sinks behind the Andes, its crimson glow mirrored in the shattered windows of a presidential palace. An intercepted broadcast crackles through clandestine radios. Tonight, we reclaim our future. Lantern light flickers across the scholar's anxious face, and in that pregnant pause, listeners feel the quatrain's living pulse and ancient warning transmuted into modern fury, forcing us to witness how quickly gold turns to dust and power to ruin. In the ghostly half-light of our digital age, the sixth quatrain unfurls like a virus in archaic French, lorsque dufer. Branch attends his isles, les sights. Sazupire sans souffle ni veil, le silence plonge l'empire de l'aube. Et les ediles mems trembling dans les veils. Its words a cryptic prelude to the greatest blackout in North America. Translated, it warns that when the shadow of iron wiring spreads its wings, cities will slumber without breath or watch, silence will drape the dawn's empire, and even the stars will shiver in their vigil. Immediately, scholarly commentary punctures the mystery, for Branch alludes to modern power grids entwined with digital arteries. Empire de l'aube evokes our continent's waking hours, now vulnerable to unseen warfare. Yet, before analysis can fully settle, the narrative surges into stark reality. Imagine New York's skyline going dark at dawn, office towers plunging into pitch black as screens flicker out, subways halting mid-tunnel, and the hum of data centers fading into an uncanny quiet. A lone cybersecurity analyst, bathed in the glow of backup generators, whispers through scrambled radio channels. They hit the backbone first, her voice trembling with disbelief, as she watches cascading failures ripple from coast to coast. Objective insight returns. Experts trace the roots of this prophecy to rising tensions in cyberspace, where state-sponsored hackers weaponize code to sever our interconnected lifelines. But tension mounts once more as emergency alerts chime across smartphones now rendered useless. Encrypted messages spilled on the dark web declare Operation Nightfall complete. And utility crews find their diagnostic consoles locked behind ghostly firewalls. In that agonizing limbo between scholarly dissection and the harrowing drama playing out on silent streets, listeners feel the Quatrains pulse, a warning that when our iron wings take flight in cyberspace, even the brightest city lights can be extinguished in an instant, leaving us to confront our fragility beneath a trembling canopy of stars. Quan le ciel de flammes dever la vert étendue. Les steps lointain se draperont de cendres, les vents du nord souffleront la braise, et la terre elle-même aspirera son dernier souffle. Translated, it warns that when skies of fire consume the green expanse, distant steppes will don cloaks of ash, northern winds will stoke the embers, and the earth itself will gasp its final breath of prophecy that scholars link to the infernos, ravaging Australia's bushlands and Siberia's tundra. In the muted glow of a dying ember scandal, the quatrain unfolds its mystery, dragging us from hushed wonder into stark analysis. The green expanse evokes Australia's ancient eucalyptus forests, northern winds conjure Siberia's gale-swept plains, and ash-cloaked steppes reflect the swathes of scorched earth stretching beyond the horizon. Yet before the academic voice can fully untangle these metaphors, the narrative surges into visceral panic. Imagine satellite feeds flickering as massive fire fronts, lit by hurricane-force winds, race across parched landscapes, while emergency sirens wail through Adelaide's empty streets and convoys of firefighters race beneath an orange sky. A weary ranger's voice cracks over a crackling radio channel. It leapt the containment line in seconds, her words raw with disbelief. As she watches treetops explode into pillars of flame, detachment returns for a moment. Climatologists note that record-breaking heat waves and drought, fueled by our warming world, have transformed seasonal fires into apocalyptic conflagrations. But drama reignites in a heartbeat. Refugee camps spring up on the fringes of burned towns, their inhabitants huddle beneath tarps as ash drifts like snow, and an encrypted alert pulses across activist networks. Operation Ember Storm engaged. The candle guttering, the scholar's quill hovers above scorched parchment, and in that trembling silence, listeners are suspended between dread and revelation, haunted by an ancient verse, whose embers still burn bright in the world's most distant, most vulnerable corners. Quan les greniers de borden these silences, les pas of fames fouleront les frontières, sous l'ombre de baobabs de seches, les larmes s'écarent sur les visages aimers. Translated, it murmurs that when the granaries overflow with silence, hungry feet will trample borders. Beneath the shade of withered baobabs, tears will parch on bitter faces, a dark intimation of looming famine and mass migration across Africa. First, the scholar's measured voice lays bare the quatrain's symbolism. Granaries of silence evoke failed harvests and empty storehouses. Withered baobabs stand for ecosystems collapsing under drought. Trampling borders warn of desperate masses crossing lines once respected. Yet before this clinical lens can settle, the narrative surges to life. Imagine dawn breaking over the Saul, its ochre sky pierced by acrid dust, as a ragged caravan of families sets out across cracked earth. Children clutching tattered sacks of grain that have long lost their promise. A refugee aid worker's radio crackles to life. Her voice, thick with exhaustion, confesses, "We've run out of water, and hope is the only ration left." And in that admission, prophecy and present collide. Objective insight returns. Climatologists link these tragedies to shifting monsoon patterns and desertification accelerated by a warming planet, while political analysts trace the collapse of agricultural markets to global price shocks and local mismanagement. Yet the story refuses to dwell solely in analysis. We're thrust back into drama as satellite imagery reveals swollen rivers breaching makeshift dams, inundating sprawling refugee camps where despair festers like a wound. At night, the howl of distant motorcycle convoy smugglers guiding families toward uncertain borders echoes under a grotesque moon, and clandestine messages pulse through encrypted networks. Operation Baobab begins at first light. The lantern's flame stutters, elongating shadows over the scholar's quivering hand, and listeners find themselves suspended between dread and revelation, bearing witness to an ancient warning that still resonates across parched landscapes. When the granaries fall silent, humanity's most vulnerable will rise, driven by hunger into the unknown, and the world will be forced to reckon with tears that refuse to be shed in silence. Dans le sable ou le crescent se perdit sang. Le chef tombera sous le pointeur d'un frère oubli. Les mosques s'inclinèrent devant la colère, et l'aube ne s'en pleurera un empire déchu. In the flicker of candlelight, this quatrain emerges like a silent echo across dunes of time. Translated, it warns, in the sands where the crescent dons its blood-red veil, the leader will fall by a brother's forgotten blade. Mosques will bow beneath the tide of wrath, and the newborn dawn will weep for a fallen empire. At once, we slip from poetic mystery into incisive commentary. Crescent evokes nations bound by faith and tradition. Blood-red veil, the sectarian strife bleeding through borders, and the brother's blade in assassination born of betrayal within ruling elites. Yet, before detached analysis can settle, the narrative surges forward. Imagine the desert capital at twilight, marble minarets casting long shadows as an armored convoy snakes through silent streets. Suddenly, gunfire fractures the hush and echoing crack that reverberates against sandstone walls, and a crowned figure, flanked by bodyguards, crumples to the dust. A journalist's whisper crackles over a covert feed. He fell before his people, struck by one he called kin. Objective insight returns. Historians point to patterns of palace coups and internecine rivalries that have reshaped Middle Eastern power dynamics for centuries, often under the radar of global headlines. But the story refuses to remain academic. The camera pans to a weeping grandmother clutching a blood-stained keffiyeh, the cold steel of betrayal still glinting in her grandson's eyes as he vows, "This is only the beginning." In the command center, encrypted messages blink. Operation Crescent Moon complete, stirring panic in distant embassies. The candle guttering, the scholar's pen hovers, caught between recording prophecy and invoking change. In that charged moment where analysis and drama converge, listeners are pulled into a climax of suspense and consequence, left to ponder whether this ancient verse is mere forewarning or an urgent summons to confront the ever-shifting sands of power. In the trembling glow of the scholar's candle, the final quatrain materializes like a verdict carved in stone. When the world's last trumpet sounds beneath the blood-red sky, nations will stand at the crossroads of unity or ruin. Only those who bind their hearts together will shield the flame of hope from the gathering storm. Immediately, we shift from that spectral utterance into incisive analysis. Here, trumpet symbolizes an irrevocable moment of reckoning. Blood-red sky, the culmination of every prior crisis, wars, plagues, storms, and betrayals, and the crossroads embodies humanity's perennial choice between fracturing or forging bonds anew. Yet before we can settle into detached commentary, the narrative surges forward. Imagine a windswept plateau at dusk, where emissaries from every embattled corner of the globe converge around a fractured obelisk, its hieroglyphs aflame under a dying sun. The scholar's voice, measured and urgent, intones that 16th century poets used such imagery to compel collective action, warning that isolated efforts doom us all. But drama erupts as banners whip in gale-force winds, each bearing the scars of conflict-torn flags from Eastern Europe, singed standards from flooded coastal cities, ash-stained pennants from scorched forests, and delegates clasp hands in a moment suspended between dread and defiance. A hush falls, broken only by a lone harp's lament echoing like a heartbeat across the vast plain, and an aged envoy raises a trembling fist, whispering, "We choose the bond of our shared fate." Objective insight returns. Scholars note that this crescendo mirrors our era's call for global solidarity in the face of systemic collapse. From climate breakdown to cyber warfare, yet as the harp's final chord fades, an encrypted broadcast crackles through field radios. The flame endures only if we kindle it together. Lantern light flickers violently, shadows mingle and stretch toward the horizon, and listeners are left perched on the precipice of possibility haunted by an ancient summons that still demands our unity, lest we witness our shared world unravel into ruin. In the gathering gloom, a dissonant symphony swells as all 10 of Nostradamus's warnings collide. Coastal megastorms batter crumbling seawalls. Migrant caravans surge under armed patrols. Power grids flicker into oblivion. And unseen pathogens slick city streets with panic. And you, the lone witness, feel the air crackling with portent. As Nostradamus foretold, the year's darkness gathers in tones of voice that seems to echo from every corner of time, peeling back centuries to reveal a tapestry of crisis woven tight around our present. Suddenly, the scene fractures into shards of living newsreel, the guttural roar of sirens dueling with the metallic hiss of emergency broadcasts, protest chants cascading over one another like a tide of human despair, and the distant howl of winds that flatten bridges and choke skylines in a single swell. Yet, even amid this cacophony, a scholar's calm commentary slices through. These calamities, once isolated and disparate, now pulse in unison. As if bound by an invisible thread first spun in 16th century ink, we learn how quatrains about exile and uprising converge with modern riots, how plagues predicted in hushed Latin whispers bloom into feral pandemics, and how metaphors of iron wings now manifest as cyber attacks stripping us bare of light and warm thought. But analysis soon fades beneath the mounting drama. The candle in the scholar's hand gutters, its flame snuffed by an unseen breath, and in that pregnant silence, the overlapping cacophony erupts. Once more news clips layered like fractured mirrors, each reflecting a different facet of apocalypse. A single, sustained chord of sirens stretches into eternity, merging with the final, anguished cry of a city under siege. And in this crucible of sound and fury, listeners teeter on the brink, hearts pounding to the pulse of a prophecy fulfilled, uncertain whether they stand before ruin or the ember of a new dawn. In the aftermath of that roaring crescendo, a profound hush settles over the embers of our shared ordeal, as though the world itself holds its breath at the crossroads of fate. Are these 10 calamities scripted in stone, or do they crack open a window we can force ajar? In the flicker of candlelight, scholars lean across dusty tomes to debate whether Nostradamus's quatrains are inexorable prophecies or urgent alarms. We still have the power to silence each voice, weaving analysis of past pandemics, climate, tipping points, and geopolitical fractures into a tapestry of caution and possibility. Yet beneath this measured discourse, our story pulses with lived urgency. Refugees forging new paths, activists rallying beneath bannered bridges, scientists racing to decode viral genomes, citizens grappling with blackouts by candle and coded radios. Now, the scholar's whispered counsel becomes a rallying cry. How will you answer each alarm? And the echoes of that question ripple outward, inviting listeners to lend their voices, their strategies, their resilience to a global conversation that must not end in despair. As digital forums ignite with stories of grassroots innovation and collective resistance, a final, tantalizing note glimmers on the horizon. What if Nostradamus had more to say about 2030? A promise that our journey through prophecy is only beginning, that the next chapter awaits those daring enough to listen, interpret, and act before the next trumpet sounds beneath another blood-red sky, beneath an undercurrent of dark ambient, drones and distant rumbles of thunder. Each episode of this chronicle unfolds like a ritual and ominous tapestry woven with sirens' wails, protest chants, and the subtle scrape of ancient parchment. Yet every sound is meticulously placed to transport listeners from one quatrain's haunted imagery to the next. At the heart of each 4-minute descent into Nostradamus's verse, a single narrator's grave timbre guides us, punctuated by the raw urgency of 2 eyewitness actors whose whispered confessions and urgent alerts lend flesh and blood immediacy to centuries-old prophecy. Objectively, this fusion of storytelling and sound design demands precision. Thunderclaps calibrated to echo, coastal deluges, riot sirens timed to crescendo alongside translations, and the distant crow of a war drum underscoring scenes of political betrayal. Each effect mapped to its quatrain's locale, so that listeners feel the salt spray on flooded streets, the acrid tang of tear gas in urban squares, or the sulfurous heat of wildfire. Yet beneath this technical rigor lies an invitation to participation. Following each chapter's dramatic climax, a transcript complete with French originals, English renderings, and Vietnamese translations is released on the website. Footnotes, illuminating every metaphor, every obscure reference, turning passive reception into active scholarship. As the final embers of sound fade, an insistent challenge emerges: decode the next quatrain yourself. Share your interpretation under our dedicated hashtag, and watch as social media becomes a living forum for collective divination. Scholars may debate pacing a brisk 4 to 5 minute total runtime, ensuring momentum without fatigue, but listeners become the true narrators, breathing fresh life into the verses through their own insights, their own digital dialogues. In this way, production and engagement merge into a single arc of mystery and meaning, each carefully mixed heartbeat of sound, each dramatic actor's gasp. Each scholarly footnote is not merely production detail, but a thread in a larger tapestry, one that crescendos not only in audio climax, but in the shared human act of confronting ancient warnings, forging new connections, and daring to shape destiny before the next trumpet sounds beneath another blood-red sky.